This morning on the Ag Issues program, a pleasure as always to bring back to the program and in studio this morning, Roger McEowen, professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, as he joins us on the program this morning. Roger, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Greg. Good to be with you.
Absolutely. And let's get to it. First thing we want to talk about is, I understand, late developments on a case on Friday out of South Dakota that people may be familiar with.
Well, Greg, it looks positive that we may have some news this week breaking on the mod situation in South Dakota. Those are the ranchers that border land that is operated by the Forest Service east of Custer, South Dakota, and west of the Badlands, so kind of south of the interstate there near that area. And it looks like as of right now or as of Friday that the criminal charges against the Maud family will be dropped. Unfortunately, it also looks like it's going to be converted into a civil trespass. Now, there are ways to deal with a civil trespass. I think we've got a couple of avenues. The Small Tracts Act is one of those provisions that we can use, and there may be another one out there. But that could also be dismissed this week too. I think that's the administration's direction to the USDA was to drop this case, not convert it to a civil trespass. But it looks like that is what has happened late on Friday, and hopefully we'll see some more positive developments on that this week.
All right, thanks for the update on that. But let's get to some of the things we're going to talk about in estate and transition planning, which has been talked ad nauseum here recently, and good reason why as well. So if you own farmland, it can be owned in an IRA. But the question is, should it? And what if you want to continue farming the land as well? So what are the ideas with holding farmland inside of an IRA?
Well, the short answer, Greg, is don't do it. Can you do it? Sure. You can put farmland in an IRA. You should not do it, particularly if you want to continue farming, because you can't farm it. Once it's in an IRA, that'll cause the entire thing to become taxable. There are many actions that are prohibited when land is put in an IRA. You can't farm it, nor can anyone closely related to you farm that land. You can't even do personally any work on that land. You can't mow grass waterways. You can't paint a barn. You can't do any maintenance. And any rent, if you rent it out, it has to be fair market value. You can't mess around with the rental rates. You have to stay at fair market value. And if you borrow funds to buy the land that you then put into the IRA, you can't personally guarantee the debt. And if you do finance the purchase, part of your rental income is going to be subject to income tax, and the IRA is going to have to file an income tax return. Plus, it's got to be treated like an IRA. You're going to have a custodian handle the transaction and the ongoing ownership of the land in that IRA. And then once you turn 73 now under the new rules, that land, not only is it going to have to be appraised every year, once you hit 73, you're going to have to partially distribute the land annually. It's just a bad idea to put land into an IRA, and I probably get that question 2 or 3 times a year, and my response is what I just gave you: don't do it.
Yeah, I like how you ended that in your Substack. Do you still want to own land in an IRA? No, definitely. Okay, here's another part of this as well with succession planning. Can be, obviously it can be complicated, but it can be made more difficult when property that is transferred in the next generation to the next generation is not debt-free.
Yeah, as planners, we always have the greatest deal of flexibility to satisfy a client's goals and wishes and their legacy plan if that property is debt-free. Particularly, I'm talking about the land as the number one asset for most farmers and ranchers. Now, what happens on gifts, of course, is the big issue is basis, and the basis of the donor is going to carry over into the donee's hands, and that can be a problem when we're talking about farm property because a lot of that land may have a relatively low basis. But if that property doesn't have a cost basis, let's say that we're talking about machinery and equipment that has been depreciated out. You've taken bonus depreciation, Section 179 depreciation, so you've wiped out your basis in that property. So there's no cost basis, but yet you still owe on that, so there's debt against it. Well, that triggers income tax. So let's say, for example, Greg, that Dad's got a fully depreciated tractor that still has $100,000 debt on it. It may be worth $400,000 or $500,000, but it's got a $100,000 debt on it. If he gifts that tractor to, let's say, his daughter, he's going to have to pay tax on $100,000 of gain. It's treated as a sale. Now, while dad continues to owe the debt, he's going to have to make sure he's got enough income to pay for that transaction. And the same thing occurs if you've got it inside a partnership. There are many zero-basis farm assets that are held in a partnership, such things as grain inventory or prepaid inputs, as well as machinery and equipment. But the partnership might have debt. So a gift of a partnership capital account is going to trigger income tax on the amount of that negative capital account. Now, if you die, you get a step-up basis under the current rules. That solves the problem and wipes out the negative capital account that then can be gifted to the next generation. But that's not the plan that a lot of people want. Now, death does solve a lot of problems from a tax standpoint. Of course, you're not around to see the property go to your heir. But this issue of gifting property with debt on it, we've got to be very, very careful about that. And people need to get good tax advice before they do those things.
Well, one of the simple things as well, if you're transitioning the farm or ranch business, how do you plan to be able to do that, and how will the next generation handle it, and probably what should you be considering when it comes to the transition planning?
Well, the business of production agriculture has certainly gotten more complex over the years, and that complexity has bled over into estate and business planning and transition planning, and it becomes more complex. So when we think about transition planning for the farm business, some people have heirs to pass the property to, some have on-farm heirs, some have a mix of on-farm and off-farm heirs. But what are your options if you don't have anyone in the next generation of your family to pass the business to? One, you could just sell everything off, or you might be able to work with a neighbor or a younger farmer in the area to take over the business while you're trying to transition into retirement. If you have employees, the question would be, are any of them good managers that might be interested in taking over your farming operation if you don't have heirs? Now, some states do have beginning farmer programs, and that might be an option in those situations. But for those people that do have heirs that are interested in taking over and running the business and managing the business into subsequent generations, the question that we often want to try to tease out from clients is, do these heirs actually understand what they don't know? And that's really a key aspect in any line of business, not just agriculture. But do you understand what you don't know? And will you ask for help? And that can be a sign of a potentially good manager who recognizes that they don't know it all, and they'll ask questions to try to get up to speed. This came to light to me a couple of weeks ago because I was dealing with that very situation involving a farm and ranch family, and the parents were struggling with a child that they felt, if you remember growing up as a kid, there was one cartoon series that had Mr. Know-It-All. If you remember that. Mm-hmm. Well, Mama said that they've got a son that's a Mr. Know-It-All and is not on the farm but wants to run the farm and tell his on-farm brother how to run things because he doesn't know everything. The one brother does that has all the degrees behind his name. Well, that can create a lot of tension and a lot of problems. Now, the other side of this, Greg, is when we transition to the next generation, not only do we want to get the control into the right hands of those that can manage the business, but we have to have an exit plan for ourselves. We have to be able to step aside, and that can be difficult for some people to get out of the control aspect of the business. That's a hard one for many families. And the whole thing here, Greg, I guess to sum up this portion, is that transition planning is a process, and you need to think long-term, and there's a whole host of things to think about.
Well, speaking of thinking about, if you're wanting to go into farming full-time, there might be a substantial asset you could tap to create the necessary working capital. Talking about the 401k, your retirement account. Yeah,
this is one for someone that wants to start in farming later in life and maybe buy a 40 or an 80 and raise various types of livestock or have more than what we would call a hobby operation. They really want to do this full time, but they haven't been farming. It's just kind of been a dream of theirs. And so they've been employed and they have a 401 retirement account with that employer. And given the capital-intensive nature of farming and the asset cost that it requires to get a line of equipment and machinery and all the other various types of assets, let alone the land, maybe you could tap into the 401k funds to start your farming operation, to use that as your startup capital. And you can, and there's some good things about this. Now, you're going to have to create a C corporation to establish a 401k and then roll over your current 401k from the old employer into that new 401k plan, and then that plan buys shares in the corporation and becomes an owner. Well, the money then that's put into the corporation then becomes the working capital that corporation can use to buy equipment and plant crops and acquire land and livestock as well as other assets. And there's no limit to how much the 401k can buy. And so unlike borrowing funds from your 401k, which is limited to $50,000, or even cashing in the plan and paying taxes and a 10% penalty on the funds received, you can put, with this technique, a significant amount of capital into the farm business in a pretty tax-efficient manner.
Roger McEowen, professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, is joining us. And we had mentioned we're going to talk about drone technology, Roger, and it's definitely ushered in a new era for various government inspection processes, but it's also kind of intersecting with other ones as well, specifically, or most notably, maybe is the better way to put it, is the plain view doctrine. And so explain the plain view doctrine and drones and why this is important.
Yeah, this is a big deal, Greg. This technology is intersecting with the law in an interesting way, and it brings up a principle or a doctrine that the U.S. Supreme Court came up with over 50 years ago, back in 1971. And, of course, it intersects with the Fourth Amendment, which requires the government to get a warrant before they can search your property. But if they can fly a drone over your property and take a look at your farm, take a look at activities on your farm and what you're doing, as well as a small business, for example, or any business, they can fly a drone over your property and determine whether there are any code violations. They don't have to send an individual out there to get an inspection. And they don't ask you for your permission. Well, how does that play out when we have a Fourth Amendment, we have privacy expectations, those types of things? Well, this plain view doctrine, which came out of a case that the Supreme Court decided in 1971, is a pretty well-established exception to the Fourth Amendment's warrant requirement, which protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, what that means, first from a law enforcement side of things, and then we can talk about how insurance companies are using this now, which really gets into the nitty-gritty when it comes to a farming operation. But the plain view doctrine will allow law enforcement officers to seize evidence of a crime without a warrant if they meet three conditions. One, the officer has to be lawfully in a position to observe the item that's in plain view and have lawful access to that object itself. And then secondly, the incriminating nature of that item is immediately apparent, and then the evidence has to be discovered inadvertently. So if it's just sitting there in plain view, the officer has a right to be where they're at, they just happen to see it, that's what the plain view doctrine covers. That's fine. You don't need a warrant for that when it's in their plain view. Now, in 1990, the Supreme Court pared that doctrine back a bit in another case, and they eliminated the inadvertence requirement because they said, well, the Fourth Amendment's particularity requirement also bars just simply general exploratory searches. And in effect, the past 19 years, they said the inadvertence requirement was difficult to apply in practice. So they kind of eliminated that one. Then we get into the issue of drones that are used for inspections, and this is where it really gets more complex. Can you have local government officials, appraiser's office, for example, send a drone out over your property and determine how you're using your property? Maybe you're zoned agriculture and you're not really using it for agricultural purposes. This comes up in the rural-urban fringe areas. We might see this, for example, in Leavenworth County or in Johnson County or parts of Shawnee County or Sedgwick County, where you've got rural-urban fringe areas and you've got someone that wants a lower property tax classification as agriculture. And so the county flies a drone over your property to see on the interior what it is you're doing to make a determination of the proper property tax classification, or they're looking for building code violations, those types of things. Maybe you put up a new barn and they're going to check that out without physically coming on your property. Well, what type of concerns do we have there? Well, again, you kind of get into the Fourth Amendment. It's not necessarily a crime, but it's some sort of violation that's at issue. Do those views fall under the plain view exception or not? Well, you have to work your way through all of these crimes. What if they're capturing images on your property? They're looking for maybe the illegal baiting of game, say wild birds, or illegal baiting of certain other types of wildlife. That could potentially fall under the plain view doctrine if the initial drone flight was unlawful. So clearly what all this requires, Greg, is that the operator of the drone has to have expertise in identifying certain violations and understanding the scope of what the plain view doctrine is. That's the key to the whole thing. And then we get into how now insurance companies are using drones.
Yeah, and explain it. Go into a little further detail on that as to insurance companies starting to use drones.
Well, a lot of farming operations are or should be covered by a comprehensive farm liability insurance policy, and they also participate in the federal crop insurance program or similar programs that cover livestock. Well, in recent years, what we've seen is the insurance industry increasingly utilizing drone technology for property inspections. And drones are pretty useful for inspecting damage after natural disasters such as hailstorms, fires, those types of things, damage to buildings. And they're also used to assess crop health and identify potential issues like pests or diseases, and even monitor well-being and isolation of livestock. And so insurance companies are finding them as a cost saver because they don't have to send people out there, employees out there, or contractors out there to make these determinations. They can evaluate a claim, if you make a claim, faster and more economically to them. So the insurance companies like this, but there may also be, in addition to the plain view doctrine, certain state and federal regulations that also apply to drone usage. And I think you and I have talked in the past, not the recent past, but in the past, about what the state and federal rules are with respect to using drones. So, Greg, I think going out into the future, it's not hard to imagine a situation where insurance companies will routinely deploy drones to conduct not only initial but periodic inspections of insured property. And then that can be good, but it can raise some issues too. So that's kind of the changing nature of what the insurance industry is doing, and it can impact farming and ranching operations because all of the property, much farm property, is out in plain view.
Bottom line then is if you are a company, whatever the case may be, know what you're doing. Well, one, know how to fly the drone, but two, know what you're doing and what you're looking for specifically, too.
Yeah, and from an insurance company standpoint, get consent of the landowner before you send drones out there. That'll help avoid problems going forward. Just be transparent about what your purpose of flying the drone is and what the scope of the drone inspection will be, and that'll build trust with policyholders. But I see this becoming a bigger issue as we go forward.
Because it's not like, farmers are wary because they see a drone going by and they have no idea what the heck it is or why it's there. You don't know what's going to happen after that.
And the last thing we want to do as farmers is pull out that 7mm mag and shoot the drone down. Do not do that under any circumstance.
You took the words right out of my mouth. All right. Roger, if people want more information as far as this is concerned, or look at this as far as information, is this on your Substack?
No, these are on the blog.
On the blog, okay.
And so they will also be shared with K-State Ag Manager.
All right, sounds good. Roger, as always, appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg.
That is Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, as he joins us this morning on the Ag Issues program here on 580 WIBW.